Hello everyone, my name is Ann.
And my name is Yeji, and this is Our Own Canon.
We created this show as a way for us to discuss and debate pieces of art, literature, philosophy, television, film.
Basically anything and everything that has left an impression on us as Asian American college-age nerds with social anxiety and an affinity for Vietnamese iced coffee.
Nerds, which we absolutely are, so be prepared to get lost in the weeds.
But don't worry, we will offset with enough irony and sarcassery to keep things not boring.
And of course, thank you for listening and supporting the show. We hope you love what we have prepared today. Okay, Yeji, we got a good one today. But it has come to my attention that, if I make a Venn diagram of people who know me versus people who know you, and we look at the middle section, it's really just one person. So why don't we introduce ourselves first and get everyone acquainted?
Fair enough. Hello everyone, my name is Yeji Elizabeth Gill. I'm a pre-law student majoring in English and minoring in philosophy. Why I picked the two most tedious areas of study, I have absolutely no idea, but my philosophy minor is actually where and why I met On, so I guess something good came out of that. Just
The one
yeah.
thing, right?
Yeah, just the only thing. But I am planning on actually taking the LSAT on Friday, so stay tuned for that, and hopefully I get a good enough grade to be on my way to law school next year. Um, I don't know. Yeah, that's pretty much it about me. I'm not a very interesting person. I do have a cat that we might hear occasionally. He might just start screaming at some point. So, there's that. But yeah.
If we do, I won't be mad. I do love your cat. All right, and I am An Win. I'm a philosophy major on the pre-med track, so it's kind of like Yeji. I'm also going crazy and doing awful things to myself here, but I actually enjoy it. And people often ask why those two things together, and my answer pretty much changes each time. So for this time, I'll just say medicine is all about not doing harm. Philosophy is all about trying to figure out harms and stuff like that. At least for the types of philosophy that I enjoy reading and looking at. And, that sounds like they could go together plausibly.
Right, yeah. Circle.
So, how about... So people know us now. How about we tell people a little bit about how we met in the first place and how we got here?
Right. So the funny story of how we met is not a very funny story. It's mostly me being super creepy, but On and I had, I think it was intro to ethics. We had that class together, and I remember he sat in the very front of the class, and
Yeah.
that's how I recognized him because we had a logic together the next semester or something like that. And when I saw him in logic, I was like, I know that guy. I don't know anyone else in the philosophy department. And I'm not making very many friends in the areas of study that I want to be in. This is not to say that people are not nice at tech and that I wasn't meeting people. This is me being this is the only other Asian person that I have seen on campus.
And that you will ever see ever again. That
Yeah.
was it. It was over after that.
Yeah. And so I was like, okay, let me go talk to this guy. And so after class, I just approached you and I was like, hey. And that's it.
That was it.
That's how
That
we
was
met.
it. Yeah. We literally never talked. We had a class together the first semester, freshman year, and we literally never talked. It was the second semester, and
Yeah.
she's just like, "I'm hunting this guy down."
Yes. And I freaked you out. I remember I scared you a little bit because when I said hi, you weren't expecting to be said hi to. So
No.
yeah.
Also, as you mentioned earlier, both of us are awful of social anxiety, and our ability to interact in social situations is already just not great as it is.
Oh my God, literally though. Like, if
So
I hadn't said hi, we wouldn't be friends.
exactly, that was
And
it.
that took like all of my social battery for like the next week is like coming up to you and saying hello.
It worked out though because like we became friends then. We hung out a lot. We did Logic together,
hmm
and that was like all before the pandemic.
Yeah, and On was the one who got me into like board games and stuff. And
You're
yeah.
welcome.
Yes, thank you. We also had a class together last semester, which is
We
how we
actually,
sort of came up with this podcast idea, but we'll probably get into that a little bit more later.
yeah, we actually had like several classes like in and out up like throughout just our like college career in general
We
before even that
did. We
class.
did. We did, but I also can't remember what those classes were.
I I agree actually. There was like it was some sort of philosophy class. I'm
Yeah.
pretty sure. Uh, I'm
At the
also
point we're
drawing a
like
blank
we're
on
like
those now too.
yeah, we're like super into philosophy. We're like nerds and we can't remember what philosophy classes we took.
I think all of it being online, like at my desk, it all just kind of blurs together, you know? Like
Oh, yeah, yeah, maybe yeah. But
COVID has wrecked my brain in a very particular way.
we're definitely gonna talk more about COVID because COVID is like the man of the hour these past few years, which is crazy to say, but definitely affected my life more than I thought it was going to. Okay, we have sufficiently gone down this rabbit hole, but um right, like if you haven't noticed, we're nerds and we love to talk. But that isn't the specific reason why we made the podcast.
Wait, it wasn't. I thought we were actually just here just to talk.
Yeah, the sarcasm convention was like two doors down. Okay, so yeah, there we go. But as we were saying before, we took an Asian American literature class last semester.
Shout out to Professor Lomax, the best Asian American literature professor that I've ever had.
Yeah, definitely. Especially because, like, I don't know, for not being Asian, he did a very good job.
And you know what? He also did a really good job of like being really supportive about us in that class and all the crazy
Yes.
ideas that we had, including
Yes.
making a podcast.
Yes, indeed. But you want to go a little bit more into that?
Yeah. So something that we were noticing when we were taking that class was like a lack of perspective from a younger, later generation of Asian Americans. A lot of the Asian American art we saw was about things like immigration and assimilation, but us later gen Asian Americans, we see things differently. You know,
Yeah.
we find these stories to be very important and very meaningful to us, but it's also not a complete picture of who we are.
Mm-hmm.
And so we wanted to make a podcast where we can talk about art that speaks to us very specifically as later generation Asian Americans that have influenced us and our identity and our artistic identities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And of course, again, to reiterate, since we're both philosophy nerds, we also really enjoy dissecting these pieces of literature, media, movements, art, all that kind of stuff. And just to see what they're really trying to say, or at least what they're saying to us, and how they influence our world and the world's sociopolitical perspectives at large. However,
That sounds like a big however. Should I
it
be
is a
worried?
big however. Yes, you should be worried always. But while we're discussing politics and social structures and all of that good stuff, we are not attempting to persuade or take the side of anything or anyone. We think that there are enough mediums that have and are setting out to do that, and we want to be really, really purposeful in avoiding discourse that takes that shape. Unless, of course, we are using that discourse structure to make a very specific point. Though both of us stand to the left of the political spectrum, the goal of this podcast is to have open dialogue and structured debate, not to convert people into certain worldviews. We offer insights, not arguments.
Unless we're arguing with each other, because at that point I will throw intellectual hands.
Oh
Just
yeah,
just just watch out for them. Just say.
just unbridled chaos.
So, in an attempt to hopefully curb as much of this unbridled chaos as possible, well, we have a few segments for each episode that we're super excited about and would love to share to you, but I kind of also want to reveal this as they come. Have it be a
For
little
sure.
surprise.
Yeah. And I think it'll keep things interesting for sure too. We also have a few different episode structures that we'll be introducing also as we go along. And we're sort of still in the process of creating those, but they'll range anywhere from scripted argumentation to non scripted shenanigans.
Wait, so you're saying that you're gonna allow me off the chain at some point? Like, I don't think that's a great idea, but
You know
I'm
what?
here for it.
Don't even worry about it. It's going to be a problem for future us, you know?
Yeah. Okay. Fair. 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 Go for it.
Though speaking of other versions of ourselves, past us did a really, really good job in working on and putting together the podcast structure and designating what kinds of content they wanted to put out.
And now, present us will completely ignore all the things that we have done in the past couple of weeks because we want to do something a little different for our first episode. So this won't be normal, but we're going to be doing a history episode this time in particular.
Why do we do this to ourselves? Literally. Okay, anyways. Well, okay. The reason for this is that we think it'll be productive to have a general sense of how Asian American as a group and as a concept have gotten to the present and evolved on the way, and why that matters to the building of perspective that will happen throughout the rest of the podcast.
Okay, so to answer your first question, why we do this to ourselves, I suspect the answer may be because we hate ourselves. Not sure
Fair enough.
though.
Hmm.
And regarding the second point, well, I was doing some research and writing the script for this, and as it turns out, I studied philosophy, not history.
Wow,
Uh,
really?
yeah! So when I was sitting down to write this, I quickly kind of discovered that I didn't really want to write a pure history lesson. Instead, I wanted to do something a little more jank, a little more like us kind of crazy.
Yeah, a little
Uh,
quirky, not
yeah,
like other girls.
yeah. So instead of doing a history lesson, I wanted to instead track how Asian Americans were viewed both by themselves and by others throughout history, and how it led to where we are now with as Asian Americans as like the concept that we have now,
Right.
which is getting a little bit into like philosophy of identity and things like that, philosophy of language, and way more up our alley than a pure history lesson.
Yeah, fair enough.
So, with that, I present to you not a history of Asian Americans, but a history of the words that got us to Asian American.
Awesome. So then, where do we begin, An?
Well, we begin in Africa.
Huh?
Okay, kidding, but also kind of not. Uh, See, we're going to be basically spending a lot of our episodes splitting people into groups and categorizing people, but I think it's important to remember throughout this whole process that at the end of the day, we're all human and that we shouldn't forget that no matter what types of groups we're putting people in.
Yeah. Yeah, we all did sprout from the same pile of primordial goo, and we will return to that primordial goo when we are done. So, good point.
These are the quotes that people are going to remember you for. I just want you to know that.
Please don't.
Okay. So, we all started in Africa, but what happened after that?
Okay, well, after that, people got up out of the primordial goo and slowly moved throughout the rest of the world. But for our purposes, though, we're definitely going to be focusing, just a little bit more on the people who ended up in Asia.
That sounds like a good idea. I'm excited.
Right.
Well, you do say Asia, except it wasn't called Asia at the time. I think it's important to understand that at this time, Asia wasn't even like a concept. I don't even think it was a word. Uh,
Yeah,
People call Asia in the modern day, but at that time, people really just saw themselves as small individuals as part of their tribes or communities.
yeah,
Nothing on a grand scale like Asia.
for sure. I think it's important to remember here too that while Asian American as a concept it's very important to identity and to a specific group of people. And so when it wasn't that, it's just interesting to think about how far we've come from there, like how Asia as a place has evolved into an identity that so many people carry with them, you know?
hmm Especially like when people there was a time where that was just not a thing that existed, right?
Exactly.
It's it's
Like,
it's surprisingly actually very modern.
right. And like, how does that happen?
Well, we'll get to that.
Right. Well, from here, let's skip a couple hundred years to land in the colonial era.
My favorite era, the part where all the history question can be answered by because colonialism.
Right. All the bad things can be answered by.
All right. For this era, I think it's useful to view the world through two perspectives. So we're going to be balancing two things at once: the
Mhm.
Eastern perspective and the Western perspective. Note that you can't see it, but I'm using air quotes here when I say Eastern and Western.
Oh, you're using. Okay, well, if a tree uses air quotes and there's no one around to see it, did it really use air quotes?
Yes. No. Wait. Yeah.
Mm.
Are you trying? I'm trying to do a history lesson here. Why are you
I'm trying
philosophizing
to
with me?
I'm trying to philosophize with you right now.
Different episode. Different episode. We got to stay on track today.
Okay, well, fine. So, how did the East see themselves in particular?
Well, the East, they largely saw themselves as individuals who were parts of communities who were then often parts of dynasties. Uh, so the so as you can see in the East, people viewed themselves in a very like multi-layered way. They weren't just like one thing. They were themselves who were in this community, who were in this other community, and so on and so forth.
I think that's something that we see often in Eastern histories, whether it be in philosophy or in religion, is that the East definitely viewed themselves as parts of a bigger whole always, whether it was part of cycles, part of like a hierarchy of people, and those divisions could happen based on social class, um, like material possessions and religious faith and different things like that. So we will probably cover this again in another episode, but like the main difference between how the East developed and how the West developed, philosophically, socially, politically, was that Eastern people often saw themselves in this very multi layered way versus the West as seeing themselves as very individualized. And that came into play a lot, I feel like, in the differing views and the clashes between these people during colonialization and stuff, and like why the East at some point was viewed as so vastly different from the West, and you know,
Mm-hmm.
stuff like that.
So we know how the East view themselves. So how did the West view themselves? I think the really important part here is like the West viewed the East differently. Instead of seeing the East as individuals and communities, the forces of colonialization kind of force everything to be viewed very politically,
Right.
right? It's if you're a colonist, right, or if you're doing things that colonists do, it's a lot easier to deal with groups of people rather than like individual communities, right? It's much
Right.
easier to deal with like the dynasties that had political power rather than the individual communities that were involved here. So the
Mhm.
West began to view Eastern countries as political entities instead of individual communities.
Right. And obviously, this it very much plays into how colonialism's only concerns really were like economic or financial gain and or like exploitation of land and peoples. Colonialization lent itself to a lot of problems, but I think, as On was saying, one of the biggest issues that really did happen in colonialization of viewing everything so politically and as so consolidated as these big groups to be dealt with as these big groups and not as people was that people were being viewed as these giant like monolithic groups that were all the same and that were being used or framed in this economic financial gain view of these people are resources, this land is resources, and how can we make the most out of these. And yeah, that was a big problem and it still kind of is a problem.
It's a problem that still has echoes in how they persist to this day. Like the whole reason I have this segment in here is because of how this will echo into later.
For sure. And I think that the way that art is often the way that Asian American art, at least, is often portrayed in, is in this frame, is within that frame of like the historical context of colonialization and stuff. So we'll definitely talk more about that.
Okay, so from there we get to the term Oriental.
Yikes.
Yikes, indeed! But as I pointed out before, colonial forces weren't particularly focused on accurate understandings or description of the East. So, we're going to be dealing with some yikes for a while.
Yeah,
Uh,
lots of yikes.
yeah, so instead of dealing with nuance, they really wanted to deal with groups, so they kind of invented the term Oriental to just kind of be a catch all for a very large group outside of themselves.
hmm but to be clear, this term now is very problematic. It's an extremely racist word, and it's very unusefully broad within the context of history as well. I think that once we started being viewed as different groups, it was just kind of like we cannot be all defined by this one word. It's so useless, you know? And then it again obviously sort of trickled down into being used as a slur, and it's very outdated in general. So definitely not using this word to describe anything from like modern times.
we're,
Oriental is a very, very outdated term.
we're using it historically right now. Um,
Yes, for sure.
Yeah, I want to get back to like that point of like unusefully broad though,
hmm
because I think it's like something really important to note about it. Because when the colonists were using the term Oriental, they were really just trying to say not West or like east of the West, right? And when I say something like that, you're gonna end up asking a lot of questions because it is unusefully broad. Like, where does the West begin and the East end? What about Russia? A lot of that country exists in the East, but it's often considered a Western country.
hmm
Also, I don't know if you know this, but as it turns out, the Earth is a globe. Uh,
What?
oh, sorry. Uh, we're gonna have to like put a trigger warning for flat earthers
What
here.
are you
I'm
telling me
about
right
to break your mind. Yeah, but assuming that the Earth is a globe, that's gonna like create a really bad problem for defining something as like east of the West, because if you like keep going east enough, you're gonna get back to where you started. So we have one problem of where does the West end and where does East begin, and we have another problem of where does the East end and the West begin. Uh,
Right. I think that the answer to all of these questions is sort of whatever the colonialists defined it as. I think that when you have the power, whatever you want to define is just define the way that you want to define it. You know, we
yeah,
have so many words nowadays that sort of fall into this category, right? Of it's whatever the bigger party wants it to mean. And again, we find this in broader context as well, like just history in general, you know? It's whatever the colonialist or whatever the person who was on top wanted it to be. And they're the ones who get to decide what is included, what is excluded, what is attempting to represent. And it wasn't a term made by the people that it was attempting to represent. You know, it was made to mean whatever the colonialist wanted it to represent. And so, again, unusefully broad, extremely outdated, and just too general to ever be useful. And now is also being used to describe this very specific historical context of the views of Oriental Asia in history. So a lot of times when you see the word Oriental being used now in modern media, modern literature, what they're specifically referring to, like, are the problematic views that were associated with the times in which this word was being used. So that's interesting too. I think that's pretty cool.
yeah. So in summary, yikes.
Yes. Yike. Okay. So, somewhere in the colonial era, which we are definitely lumping hundreds of years into this, but anyways, there was this whole thing where some dudes got mad about taxes and through this weird tea party or something. And one thing led to another, and suddenly there was a new country, America.
And with this new country, there was new opportunities. Thus, a lot of people from all around the world found themselves coming to America, including people from Asia. Now, Asian American immigration is a very complex topic, particularly when it comes to like legal policies, like Chinese exclusion and the restriction of immigrants, which in turn would create all sorts of different, distinct waves of Asian American immigration. However, while I think this is very important, it's also like a really big topic, and it's going to take us a long time
Hmm.
to really get into in detail. So I think we can come back to that in the future sometime. There's definitely pieces of art that are related to this that I think are going to be really important, really fun to explore later.
Right, exactly. But for now, of course, here are the things that were important for us to note. First, Asian immigrants helped build America. The most well known examples are the railroads, but immigrants also contributed in the form of babysitting, farm work, restaurant ownership. All of these things are kept almost on the back burner to a lot of the supposed contributions that Asian American immigrants um, gave to America that are often portrayed in a negative light. But these things were really fun details that I actually learned about in Asian American literature in Professor Lomax's class. So I thought that was interesting.
Is this podcast just going to be like a shout out to Professor Lomax show?
Honestly, this whole thing is like if we ever get a sponsor, we have to give some percentage of it to Professor Lomax with how often we're just gonna bring his name up.
That's fair. That's fair. All right. And the second thing that I think is important to know is that Asian Americans at this time didn't really see themselves as like Oriental or Asian, or any like unified identity. They instead saw themselves as some sort of mixture of their home country and or American. For example, one might view themselves as Chinese and American or Japanese and American, but there was really never this idea of like I am Asian or I am Oriental.
And I think this also, which again, something I learned in class, this contributed actually to the delay of Asians sort of consolidating as an American political group.
Mhm.
So, like from before, right, the colonialists defined them as a political group for their own gain, right? But then when we came to America, it was a little bit different because these people were being forced into these political situations or being, you know, subject to these legislations that were all grouping them together when they themselves didn't do that. Um, there was this really interesting thing that I remember reading about how, like, the Chinese and the Japanese immigrants to America did not ever associate with one another and they did not cross over because they did
Mhm.
not see themselves as one group, let alone as the words Oriental or Asian, right? And I think that's so crazy, again, to think about within the context of looking at it as, myself having defined myself as Korean American and considering how huge a part of that identity is for me as a person and considering how like how the people who came here to make that happen for me at one point did not even view themselves as that identity, you know?
Yeah,
Isn't that weird?
it's
It's kind of
crazy.
weird.
It's crazy like how different uh we grew up this whole time like with a very particular set of mind about how we view identity, and of course it's changed a bit, but just see how radically different it was from the people of the past always kind of like baffles me, but also makes me kind of like really interested and excited about like how words change like that throughout history.
For sure. I think that it's so interesting to watch how things evolve for the benefit of people because that's really what it was, you know. Um and part of this, right, is was to combat things like racism, you know. It was very important to note that racism was very prevalent in early America, not just towards Asian Americans, you know. We could point to individual acts of racism in history, but I think nothing is clearer than some of those darn legal policies that America passed those first years as a country, you know? There was yeah, the I know that we said that we were going to talk about this a little bit later, but you know that like literally a single law that singled out and excluded Chinese immigration, like literally banned it completely. And it wasn't just Chinese immigration, you know? Like they were literally lumping everyone together and being like, "No, you can't come here."
Yeah,
Insane.
and don't forget that other law where we locked up Japanese people during World War II. You know, American racism is
Yikes.
it's a big yikes. Definitely,
Yikes.
definitely have a book that I would love to get onto the one later episode that does a really good
For
job about
sure.
talking about that.
Hmm. And we'll get into all of this into more detail, but in short, right, the law was not always kind to Asian people, to put it very lightly, right? And if this law was this problematic, you had better believe that individual racism absolutely existed, just on an everyday level, and we're still feeling the effects of this today. Just to, switch out of history into modern times, the exclusion that Asian Americans have experienced in the world of COVID nowadays is truly troubling to me. And again, we will talk about this more absolutely, but that was definitely a wake up call for me as a young person living through these times for sure. I feel like there was a lot of attention drawn to this, but not a lot of attention drawn to how it was affecting people individually. Um, and that was scary, and it's still scary, you know?
Yeah, that was. All right, moving on then. From scary to wars. So I guess to more scary. uh, so I think while we're still like in talking about immigration and stuff like that, we talked about immigration before, where it's immigration of opportunity. But I also
Hmm.
think but that was a lot of the immigration before World War Two. After World War Two, it was a little different. There was, of course, a lot of immigration of opportunity, but there was
Hmm.
also the Cold War, and America got involved in a lot of wars, proxy wars all over the globe, and that caused a significant portion of immigrants during this time to be not to be refugees, not coming here for opportunities, but coming here to escape some sort of other problem in another place in the world. Immigration from countries that America was military involved with, like in the Korean War or the
Right.
Vietnam War.
I think it's also important to note that while we're viewing these wars in a historical context, like specifically the Korean War and the Vietnam War are only like a few generations away from us sitting here right now.
Yeah, literally, my dad was born in the middle of the Vietnam War, so a lot of the ways that the war affected us aren't just like some distant, far gone memory for me or my family or probably my community in general. It's something that the community
Right.
really still grapples with, and even for people who didn't live through it, like me, it still really affects us and how our parents raised us and how we view the world and things like that.
Absolutely. And I feel like I've said this 100 times, but we're definitely going to talk more about all of this stuff later in the podcast for sure. But I think it's just something important to note that these things that feel like they have happened away from us did not actually happen so far away from us, right?
Mhm. Okay, we were a bit off topic there, but getting back to topic. Okay, so I got a quiz question for you. What do you get if we take a bunch of Asian people, racism, and the civil rights movement and mix them all in a bag?
A new political term that functions as both coalitions building and a rejection of old racist caricatures.
Actually, yeah, I was not expecting you to get that, but why don't you tell me more then?
So the term Asian American was coined by Yuji Ichioka and Emma G in 1968. It served two functions. While Asians at the time viewed themselves based on their countries of origins, like we said before, Korean, Vietnamese, Chinese, etc., racists both in the public and political spheres, did not see it that way. They just saw us all as Oriental, still, which by this point had become associated with all sorts of racist stereotypes and was slowly sort of transitioning into an outdated term.
Yeah, so with this, the activists at the time needed to make a new term that both represented this diverse group of people while also being an explicit rejection of the term Oriental and all the baggage that came along with it.
Right, and the term Asian American didn't actually really stick very well at first, and would go in and out of use for the next couple of decades.
Which we will talk about, but first, we've been here a while. Why don't we take a break?
Okay.
This podcast is brought to you by Cowboy Boots. Have you ever been talking to someone and they ask you where you're from? No, where you're really from? Well, no longer is there need for fussing back and forth trying to explain that you were born in Texas. With Cowboy Boots, all you have to do is just point at your feet. Buy your pair of Cowboy Boots today. Hats and horses sold separately.
So, this podcast is an amalgamation of a lot of things. For one, people. A lot of people have helped us so far in putting all of this together, and we cannot thank anyone more than Professor Lomax at Texas Tech University. He really, really helped us put this together. He gave us the means to do it, and he gave us the ideas, the original ideas at least, and the concept to sort of put everything together. So we would not be sitting here if it wasn't for him, and so we really appreciate it. Additional shout out to Emma Nebecker for doing our cover art today. She was absolutely fantastic and super receptive to all of the ideas that we had, and we think it's a really cool sort of play on the word canon as both the physical weapon canon and also the stories that we want to tell about ourselves and our own cultural identities. So we really appreciate the both of you, and we hope to give a few more shout outs to more people soon.
So, Vincent Chin, let's talk about him.
Huge tone shift about to happen here, so let's hunker down.
All right. Vincent Jen Chin was a Chinese American man who had been celebrating his bachelor party in a strip club with a group of his friends. He was supposed to be married 8 days later.
While in the club, Chin got into an altercation with two white men named Evans and Nitz. I'm omitting their first names because I don't think they deserve the honor of being mentioned. Vincent Chin managed to escape, but the men were relentless. They chased Chin down and even offered money to a man to help find him.
When they eventually found Chin at a McDonald's restaurant, Nitz held Vincent while Evans viciously beat his head in with a baseball bat. One witness, a police officer, said that he was swinging like he was aiming for a home run. Another witness claimed that they heard Nitz and Evans yelling racial slurs and blaming Vincent for the death of the Detroit automobile industry.
Chin was rushed to the hospital and lay in a coma for 4 days, after which he died. On June 29th, 9 days after the incident, and 1 day after he was supposed to be married, Vincent Chin was buried instead.
Roughly a year later, both men entered a guilty plea for a reduced charge from murder to manslaughter. At their hearing, Wayne County Circuit Court Judge Charles Kaufman sentenced both men to only 3 years probation and a $3,000 fine.
The judge listed several reasons for his unbelievably lenient sentence. He said that Chin was the one who initiated the altercation, which wasn't true, that Evans and Nitz had no prior conviction, something that really shouldn't matter in a murder trial, that the criminal prosecutor failed to argue for a more severe sentence, and that Vincent Chin had survived after the initial assault for 4 days on life support.
Despite all the reasonings that the judge provided, I think his rationale can best be summarized with the following quote. These aren't the kind of people you send to prison.
The sentence would lead to an outcry from the Asian American community. The president of the Detroit Chinese Welfare Council said this basically amounted to a $3,000 license to kill Chinese Americans.
Okay, let's unpack this.
So, for one, I remember hearing about the Vincent Chin situation, the murder of Vincent Chin, a lot when the assaults around the COVID-19 pandemic were happening to Asian Americans. People were getting beaten to death in the streets. They were getting pushed in front of subways. And I do remember that Vincent Chin was being brought up a lot in relation to these incidents, right? Of this is coming back, right? Like
Hmm.
the murdering of Asian Americans as a reaction to something that was happening within the sociopolitical sphere that was out of their control, right? Was being pushed onto them in the most violent, just, I mean, it was insane, right? And I actually didn't know about the sentencing of Ebbins and Nitz. I actually discovered that while we were doing further research on this to include it in this episode. And I think that it adds so many more layers to the way that Asian Americans have been treated recently, too, but to the way that they were being treated within a historical context of America as well. I think that, particularly within the civil rights movement, violence against Asian Americans was largely, I don't want to say overlooked, but there wasn't enough attention being drawn to it. The fact that me, as an Asian American, right, that lives in this country, has lived here my entire life, had only ever really heard about this incident when I was a fully grown adult, right, um, is absolutely insane and to me very, very unacceptable. But the sentencing was really what jarred me just as a person, as a law student, as someone who is largely reliant on a very specific moral ethic code that I feel like I spent hours and hours thinking about, right? It's genuinely insane to me that something like this happened. And I'm sure hundreds of thousands of cases that have gone through county courts have been sentenced like this one, not just to the Asian American community, but I mean it's just it's really insane. I feel like I'm losing words to describe this because I genuinely it's such a emotionally charged thing to think about and it I don't know, it really gets me emotional, but I don't know, how do you feel about it?
Yeah, it was something that I actually literally learned about while researching this episode. Oh, actually, the other way around. I actually read about this in a book, Rise, a pop history of Asian Americans that Professor Lomax actually recommended to us. And it was actually from learning the story that actually got me thinking about like doing this episode in particular. Uh, and it's something that I've been like doing a lot of research on for like for maybe like a month or something now. And every time I think about it, it just makes me really upset and really mad that one it happened, but that two that like it never gets talked about. This is actually
Hmm.
something very significant and very uh, problematic, worrisome, uh, heartbreaking. There's all sorts of emotions that
Yeah.
goes in on this, and the fact that for so long, it just has it's just right. I wouldn't say it's not talked about a lot, but it's not talked about in on a level in which I would have been able to discover this in a more like natural way. You know what I'm saying? In a way that didn't require me to like put out effort into researching Asian Americans in order to find this.
Right, and especially because you read it in a book that was specifically about like Asian Americans, you know. I've never read about this case, at least in the research that I have done about the civil rights movement. Never once heard about the case of Vincent Chin within the civil rights movement in the context of like America as a whole, you know. Um, I think that that is not good. It's very bad, you know? It's just, it's unacceptable that one of the largest ethnic groups in this country, right, has all of this history of violence that they have experienced within this country that is largely brushed over. And what we were talking about before, about how history is defined by the colonialists and it's defined by what the people in power want it to be. This case has some of the most charged, broken rules for me, at least, I think, right? Because it is so it happened in a strip club, right? And when it was happening, the security guards that were like outside of the strip club did nothing to stop the physical altercation that started within the strip club, right? They just threw both men out on the street and then they were like, that should be fine, right? This isn't going to escalate now that they're outside of the establishment,
Hmm.
you know? Which was just grossly unthought of, right? And then the judge, right, in this county court, listing these egregiously ignorant, right, reasons for his lenient sentencing. You know, it's just a very prime example of everything that's wrong with the situations that happen surrounding violence around racism specifically, right, in America. You know, like everything was handled incorrectly in this scenario. Everything was wrong. Everything that could have gone wrong went wrong, you know, in terms of how this problem could have been solved. And I don't know. For me, reading this, I was like, well, no wonder this isn't in the history books. Look at how bad this makes America and the institutions that it has in place. Look at how bad it makes those things look,
Yeah,
you
and
know?
I think like picking up on that, it's I think something like important to know that like this isn't just a problem that like affects Asian Americans. It's a wider problem that like affects us all, right? Because
Yeah.
when I was reading the judge's sentence, something that like really just kept popping back into my head, with how he said that these aren't the kind of people you send to prison with the Brock Turner case. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
for for a little bit of background, he was convicted rapist, and he was handed a lenient sentence. And the judge, when handing that lenient sentence, he said, and I have the quote here: "He is a fundamentally a good young man from a family with a record of real accomplishment who made a bad choice during his time at Stanford of about 4 months, especially related to alcohol." Right? And it's like it's this like minds. There's no other way to put it, but it's like it's the white privilege like showing through in how people are treated differently in the legal system depending on the way that they look.
Yep. And of course, the parallels to be drawn to cases like Emmett Till or more recently, right, George Floyd.
Hmm.
It's insane. I mean, just the blatant violence and the way that he was killed, bludgeoned to death with a baseball bat, right? And then being told that like and his murderers being told that these aren't the kind of men that you send to prison. These are exactly the kind of men that you're supposed to send to prison. Beating someone to death with a baseball bat in the middle of the street right outside of a McDonald's, and you're going to say that they don't deserve to be sent to prison. I just
Yeah.
utter shock, really. It's just and it's completely invisible this case is, right? At least now, you know. Um but I guess something that I guess is good that happened at least during the time in which this case actually did happen was that it was a huge wake up call for Asian Americans at the time. Chin was Chinese, but he was killed by two automobile factory workers, and was very like it was very much linked to his position, also working at an automobile center, right? As like Toyota was killing the American automobile market at the time,
A Japanese
and
company, Toyota, a Japanese company.
right, right, exactly. Um, but it made us, right, as a political group, realize that we may see ourselves as internally different, but that the racist would never, right? So Asian American activism at this time really did increase, and it was probably the turning point of the adoption of the term Asian American as a political catch-all term for Asians within America, right? As we were realizing that again, if the racist wasn't going to separate us, why should we? You know, and I think that it's nice to know that this was a turning point within modern within historical context, right? But within modern times, I think that this case definitely needs more visibility, you know. Again, I mean, just the fact that I don't hear about this in contexts that already don't have to do with either Asian Americans or violence towards Asian Americans. You know, it's crazy. It really is.
It is.
Yeah, just particularly as a law school student too, or someone who wants to become a lawyer and protect people. It's just yeah, just very yikes. I'm sure we're
Ye-
gonna use this term a lot more, but yikes to the
Yikes,
absolute maximum for
indeed.
sure. Yikes indeed. Gosh. Oh.
Okay, so the Vincent Chin case caused a lot of Asian Americans to start to realize that they needed to unify if they wanted to get things done politically because they're facing the same problems whether they wanted to or not. So the term Asian
Right.
Americans started getting used as a political term that encapsulated all of us. But here's
Hmm.
the interesting thing about words is that they change meaning over time. The term Asian American may have started as a political term, but over time, as the new generation grew up with this word, they began to culturally start identifying with it.
Right. And so this has led to a dual use for the term. So, in one way, it is like an intensely political one used for rallying and coalition building in the political sphere in America, right? In the other way, it is an intensely cultural one that is mainly used for helping Asian Americans to understand their relationship to the world around them.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting because for me at least growing up, I never really saw it as like the political term that it was. I really saw it like as a cultural term. I identify with
Yeah.
the term Asian American this might be a little controversial to say, but it's also my life. But I identify with the term Asian American much stronger than I do with the term Vietnamese American. A lot more of
Mm,
a lot more of my culture identity is baked into the idea of like Asian American as a whole group. And I tend to not
right.
even really think about the political aspect of it, you know.
Hmm. I think it's also interesting that, like, while we were trying to find a way to separate ourselves from the use Oriental, we did sort of come up with a term that still kind of lumps us together in a way, but in a way that is obviously more helpful, right? And a little bit more comprehensive than Oriental as a term. But I would mostly agree with you as well. Like, um, growing up as a Korean American, I think that there were a lot of pieces and parts of my culture personally that was like really sort of coming up in the world. And so Asian American was a way for me to ingratiate myself with my Asian friends around me that weren't Korean, right? And to find that common ground with them that didn't necessarily require us to do the whole like, oh, you're specifically this kind of Asian, or I'm specifically this kind of Asian, which, you know, like some Asians get, I think, a little bit caught up on, which there's a really great thesis about that in that I've read from before of like why being able to separate yourself as, say, like Chinese American, Korean American is very culturally important and like identity wise important to so many people. But again, for me, like you were saying, I think that Asian American was a much more culturally important term for me growing up, at least. I mean, I still, if someone asked me to introduce myself, right, and what I identify with, I would probably say Korean American. But if it ever came down to the brass tacks of it, I'm Asian American through and through, you know, and that is a political identity that I will always feel a part of for sure.
Yeah, it's you were talking earlier about how like when discarding the term Oriental, we were trying to find another word, and we ended up grouping ourselves again. But I think like the really interesting thing that I kind of feel that you're noting at is that you can identify with Asian American with a much more pride than we could with
Mm-hmm.
Oriental. It's very much taking something and not repurposing it because we made a different word, but it's taking
Yeah.
this idea and discarding it of the baggage and reclaiming this idea of a unified group for ourselves in something that we can have pride
Right. And like again, tying this back into that colonial point that we were making, Oriental was a term that the colonialists made, and Asian American was a term that we made, right? Just again, like you were saying, like reclaiming that power over having unified us out of our own volition and of our own choices. You know, in doing so, we are making a statement about how we are supporting one another and how we will come through for one another when it comes down to a political stance, because at the end of the day, the big party isn't going to separate us, so we can't either, you know. And the more unified we are and the more that we are all helping, you know, all making sure that we are doing our part in that, it's so important for sure. And I don't know, I think that modern Asian Americans have so much more exposure to politics in general. I just remember when I was growing up too, my mom was never really a political person. And growing up in a household that felt not very associated with politics, but still understanding the term Asian American culturally was very interesting for me. But I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
in.
Like, were
Yeah,
your parents political people?
no, not if they were. I didn't notice. But but yeah, I do think that like our generation, or at least from what I've seen, is much more interested in that aspect of it and much more willing to use it as the political and cultural term, and to identify with with this entire term as a whole. Though that's largely my observation. You know, I can't say for sure. I do remember reading a Pew Research article some time ago uh, for my thesis that basically the likelihood of one identifying with the term Asian American is directly
Mm-hmm.
related to how it's inversely related to how much they identify with their quote unquote homeland identity, right? So if someone grew up and they have a very strong Vietnamese American identity, they're less likely to identify with the term Asian American. Whereas, like, if
Right.
me, I don't feel that pool as strong, I end up identifying with
Mm-hmm.
Asian American a lot more.
Right. That's actually really interesting. Um, I
Uh,
wonder if someone who's grown up in a very also I would wonder if like there's a correlation between identifying stronger with a term such as Korean American versus Asian American, right? And like where that preference sort of comes in. I did like I said I did see there was like this YouTube video that I watched about it a while ago about how when you are in America, right, and you are being socially and politically grouped into the terms Asian American, right, the way that you can use a term such as Korean American to separate yourself can be very important to your identity as a person because that is how um, you can, again, define yourself within this broader context, right? So, Asian American as the broad context, and then Korean American as the smaller, more identity and personal oriented identity to fit the concept, if that makes sense. So it's interesting to see how Asian American is a political term and it's a cultural term, but under the cultural term umbrella, there are so many more identities that can be described or talked about within the broader umbrella of Asian American, but as a political term, it tends not to have that separation. It tends not to have those branches because as a political term, the purpose of it and the usefulness of it comes from the consolidation of those things. So that's really interesting actually. I like that a lot. We
yeah,
should talk about that sometime.
who would have thought identity would be messy? Who would have known?
Yeah, like I gosh, I mean, it's not like hundreds of thousands of years of philosophers have talked about personal identity and how strange and wonky that can be.
Yeah.
I'm
And
sorry, Aristotle. We'll figure something out soon. You
yeah,
did your best, buddy.
this is what we're gonna do. By the end of this podcast, by the end of like the entire series, we're gonna figure out what identity is. There we go. That's our goal.
Please don't be setting goals like this for us. We're never gonna get
I mean, if there's anything philosophers are good at, it's like setting goals and then never reaching them. Like when have you ever walked out of a philosophy class understanding things? I haven't.
Yeah, literally never. I don't think that's yeah, no, never. I don't think that's ever gonna happen, actually. But I guess in terms of confusion, right? It's also nice to know that, within this historical context, as a peoples, overall, we've come a really long way. From not identifying ourselves as anything associated with one another to being forced to be identified with one another to transitioning to being together as a choice and coming together in a foreign land, right? Um, that is just largely still really new to us. We're still in this era of assimilation and of immigration and um again, we're only a few generations removed from all those wars and stuff that happened. So it's it's funny to look back because it's like we didn't make any progress. We're not making any progress, and then we made progress.
And the thing's also like interesting. Like it may not feel like we've made progress, but also like the beginning of this like political like action as Asian Americans as a whole, it like started at the like Asian American as a term, like we said before, was like made in the 1968, right? But it wasn't really used until like we have later problems like Vincent Chin, which was not that long ago. That was
Yeah.
like in the 1980s. That's 1983. Like that,
Yeah.
that was like 40 years ago. I can do math, right? That was 40 years ago, right? So it may feel like it may feel like we're moving slowly compared to like all the racism that's ever happened in America, but actually in the
hmm
amount of time that we've actually been actively trying to deal with this problem, we've actually gotten a lot done.
hmm Yeah. And that's encouraging, I think. And it sets up for what we're doing very well. I think we've come to this party at a good time to contribute our own, perspectives on that. And I think that's what we're really trying to do here. And it's encouraging to see that perspectives like ours can do things and they can get things done?
Yeah. All right. We've talked a lot. Uh, so I think we have made it through this whole journey. Uh, yeah, we're
This
done now.
whole journey, this
We're
one episode.
we're done now. You're right. Actually, we're not done. Like not even close.
Yeah.
All the things that we left out when like writing this script and trying to figure out how to do this. I read a lot of things. You read a lot of things. Not everything we could fit in here. So we'll make sure to put all of like the extra readings materials and like all the fascinating things we found in the description,
Mhm.
along with all of our
Yes.
sources. That will all be there.
Yes. Please go check those out because we are not plagiarizers. We promise. But, okay, before we go, we thought we would give you guys a little bit of an extra treat, which is probably something we're gonna try to do every episode. It depends on how much time we have, though, throughout the week, because this particular segment does require us to be ingesting new media, and I don't know about you, but this semester started out with a hell of a bang, and so I have no time right now, but why don't you introduce that segment for us?
Okay, so this is a segment that we're gonna call Gems of the Week. This one's like pretty easy in comparison to the other things that we want to do. It's just us checking in with each other to see to see what like we've been like listening to, watching, reading,
Mhm.
etc. this week. Uh,
For sure. Also, the name Gems of the Week, that is in construction at the moment. It might change.
yes, we had a
Yes.
list of segments and we came up with great names for all of them except Gems of the
Yes.
Week. That is the one that
Yes.
we've been stumped on. So
Yeah.
if you want to
It's like
send
the
your
one thing.
to our like one listener, if you want to send in a recommendation for another name for the segment, I will be very open to it.
Yes, please do.
Okay.
Okay,
Um,
well,
you want to go first, or you want me to go
what
first?
are you I don't know, what are you listening to now? Or what are you looking at the moment? Because I feel like we usually talk a lot about this, but we've mostly been talking about the podcast recently, so we haven't actually been like
That's true.
fangirling over any new media with each other. So I really don't know what you've been up to.
All right. So for reading, I just finished Song of Achilles. So shout out to Gwen for recommending me that book. That was a
Ooh.
real fun one. Have actually, even if you've heard of it, I'll describe it anyways for people who haven't. It is a modern retelling of the Iliad, right? And the author's conceit is kind of like the Iliad is actually not like an action story. It's actually a love story between Achilles and Patroclus, and she wanted to do a modern retelling that really focuses on that relationship, and make that the central focus of the story, while also like providing a very interesting modern lens, that involves a lot of the things that we have come to, a lot of what the gay rights movement has provided us. And she kind of like incorporates that into the book as well. So it's a very fascinating read. Um, the person who recommended it to me, Gwen, said that it's a beautifully written book, and I don't know how I can explain it other than that. It actually is just a very beautifully written book.
Kind of love everything about that. So I don't know if you know the YouTube channel Overly Sarcastic Productions, but one of the channel hosts, her name is Red. She does what are basically modern retellings of like mythology and classical literature and different things like that. And honestly, I would not be at all interested in reading something like the Iliad unless it was told in like at least a kind of contemporary way, because I swear to gosh, literature major, but Greek epics, Greek plays, Greek anything, so boring. So boring in its natural, like in its natural original form. And as an English major, I will own saying that. Because
Oh,
anyone who's read the Iliad and says like, "Oh, it's so fun. Like it's such a fascinating book," is lying out their ass. Shit is boring as fuck, man. Okay? Don't even lie to me. I know that you didn't think it was interesting. You just read it for the clout. So, I'm going to read the Song of Achilles and I'm going to be cool and I'm going to have a good time while I'm doing it.
to be fair, you are an English person. It was written in Greek, so like you don't have to like it. It's not even
It's
English.
so tedious and it's so long and it's just I mean, I appreciate the artistic value of that kind of literature. I appreciate the classics for being classics, but if you're going to make me sit down and read the Iliad word for word, I will not have a good time. I refuse to have a good time while doing that.
I will say though that the book is, in my opinion, kind of better for at least knowing the story of the Iliad, because the author, Madeline Miller, throughout the book has a lot of like this very uh, these like these these moments where it's just tragic because you know how the story is going to end. She'll say things, and then you knowing how it's going to end, you're going to be like, "Oh, that is like such a painful thing to say because this is not going to turn out well." Like
Right.
yeah, it's like knowing that this is a tragedy, and knowing and experiencing all the happy parts at the beginning of the book really, I think, enhance the experience in that way.
Right, for sure. I also do enjoy that she made it about Achilles and Patroclus because I feel like that in particular is a love story that is often glossed over because homophobia. And like that's literally what the story is about, you know? And it's what a lot of Greek stories are about. You
Hmm.
know, I like it's just it's crazy to me that in a culture that was so open to the idea of men loving men in an erotic way, right? Like the concept of eros, right?
Yeah.
and having, romantic relationships with people that you are close friends with, or even having being in love with your friends in a friendly way, right? Like you can love someone platonically. Like that is something that is so lost on us as a modern audience because of all the romance peddling that happens nowadays. And so I think it's so fascinating actually. Like I really actually want to read this book now, but like because this is she read she wrote that book with the context in mind, which is not how a lot of these stories are actually told, which I appreciate
All right.
a lot.
So that's my recommendation. Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. What about you?
By
What are you up to by Madeline Miller?
by Madeline Miller. All right, I would definitely check that out. Gosh, all right. So this might be a controversial opinion,
Okay, go for it.
but House of the Dragon on HBO, the prequel to the Game of Thrones series, is actually really good. It's only 3 episodes in right now, and a new episode comes out every Sunday, but I actually really like this series so far, and there were so many skeptics and everything about it. But I did also start reading the books, Game of Thrones, and I just finished the first Game of Thrones book. So I'm watching the show and I'm gonna read the series Game of Thrones, like the original Game of Thrones series, while I'm sort of like reading, while I'm sort of watching the show at the same time.
Hmm.
And I will say, it's very fascinating to me how historical context plays such a huge role in writing and putting together fantasy worlds. Because when you think about how Game of Thrones was written sort of as a playoff of like the War of Roses in Dragonland, right? It's very, very intriguing. And I don't know, like fantasy is like history, but more fun.
You're gonna make some like historians really mad by saying that.
I mean, yes,
Yeah,
but
this
sometimes
episode
history is
has yeah, this episode has been us trashing on historians. So that right at the beginning, we were like, we're not going to do a history episode, and now we're trashing historians again. That's rough, man.
boring and yeah. Um, but I am really enjoying the series so far. I know I'm getting a little bit late into the Game of Thrones series, but to be completely fair with you, whenever something is super huge in the popular modern consciousness, I usually don't have the time to watch it. This is the same thing that happened with oh gosh, there was that other show. I can't remember the name of it right now, but it was like huge like a year or two ago, and I only finished watching it like right now. So I always get to things just a little bit late. And so for Game of Thrones, it's Game of Thrones is no exception. I'm getting into Game of Thrones a little bit late, but I'm enjoying myself so far a lot, actually. The books are absolutely fascinating. And they really did stay true to the book, at least in the first season of the show, from what I could see. And yeah, I'm really excited for the rest of House of the Dragon, particularly because the book critics for the book that House of the Dragon as the show was based off of, that book is called, I believe, Fire and Blood. That's the prequel books to the Game of Thrones books. This is getting kind of confusing, but basically, that book does not have very good reviews. It's supposed to be like super, super boring. I'm sorry, George R. R. Martin. If you ever hear this, which I'm sure
I'm
I apologize.
not betting on it.
But like apparently that book is such a boring read, and so I'm glad that they're making the show into something a little bit more palatable. It saves me the pain of having to read it. Okay, I'll stop now. I'll stop roasting George R. R. Martin now, but
Your
but
main point is that you do like this. Like you're roasting him, but I'm feeling like you do like it actually.
yeah. But I'm also starting the semester with a bunch of really interesting books so far too. So I'm sure I'll include some of those in the gems of the week because they're required readings. So I have to do them.
So your gems for the next couple of episodes are just gonna be this book that I read in class. Sadly,
Yeah,
well,
they've already been
maybe some of them
for
will be
me.
good. Maybe some of them will be good.
Fingers crossed. I'm reading the autobiography of Henry Adams right now for class, and kinda wanna die because
That's
it's
rough.
really boring. He
I
wrote it in third person. He was like, "Let me tell you about this guy, Henry Adams. He's freaking awesome." And it's literally it's literally just him.
Bro,
Like
I kind of want to read it just for that. Like, I want to read a book and just like ask myself the question: How much can someone suck their own dick? Like, through the book, and like this is an excellent case study for it.
Okay, but you joke about that, but it's literally that. He's like, at 8 years old, Henry Adams was fully sentient and he was fully aware of everything that was going on around him. I'm like, dude, you were 8 years old. Like, shut up.
Apparently, like his whole life didn't teach him self awareness. Well,
I
that's
know.
unfortunate. But apparently, it was good enough that your professor decided to sign it.
Adams is
So
dead.
yeah,
Also, shout out to Professor Yuan Shu, who will probably have more shout outs later, but that's the class that I'm reading that book for right now. So,
uh, actually, you showed me the
uh,
syllabus for that class, and like, they called us enemies on there, right?
yeah, they called us enemies on there. When Heaven and Earth Change Places is on there. Chinamen by Kingston is on there. Like he has like a full spread for Asian American literature for sure. So, well, I mean, both of us have read at least a few of those books just separately. So we'll definitely talk more about those, I'm sure.
Yeah, definitely. I would love to do if you like. Uh, they call us enemy. I would love to do an episode. This episode's script was both written and edited by Yeji and me.
The cover art was done by Emma Nebecker.
One final thank you goes out to Professor Lance Lomax at Texas Tech University for giving us this idea and encouraging us to pursue it.
We've linked the extra resources and readings in our description, and we hope to see y'all again next time. Thank you so much for listening.